It began with a document never meant to be seen. A sealed deed buried inside a locked red dispatch box, hidden behind layers of palace protocol and silence. When Catherine, Princess of Wales, opened what she believed was a routine estate file, she found something that froze the room. Proof that Charles III had secretly transferred Highgrove House to Prince Andrew. In that instant, a royal secret decades in the making detonated behind palace walls. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. What should have been an ordinary internal review of estate transition papers suddenly became the moment that threatened to fracture the monarchy from within. Because Catherine was never supposed to see that page, never supposed to trace that signature, and certainly never supposed to discover that one of the most symbolically charged royal properties in Britain had already been reassigned in silence. She had been called into the audit under the guise of routine oversight, a quiet administrative process meant to review estate documentation tied to long-term succession planning. Nothing about the summons appeared unusual at first, yet among the carefully stacked files, one folder immediately stood apart. It carried Highgrove's official seal, but something was wrong. The registry circulation marks, standard on every document that passed through formal palace channels, were missing. That absence was small enough to escape most eyes, but not Catherine's. The moment she opened it, the atmosphere changed. Inside lay the deed itself, stamped, authenticated, and sealed under sovereign authority. There it was in unmistakable language. Charles III had reassigned ownership of Highgrove House to Prince Andrew through a confidential transfer mechanism concealed from the normal chain of palace review. For several seconds, no one in the room spoke. Even the senior aide standing nearby seemed unable to process what the document meant. Then came the panic. One advisor stepped forward and urged immediate discretion, insisting there must be context still unknown. Another quietly closed the door, as if shutting out the truth might somehow contain it. But Catherine had already seen enough to understand the gravity of what sat in her hands. The transfer date made it worse. This had not been done recently, in haste or under pressure. The authorization predated Charles's coronation, meaning the decision had been made deliberately, carefully, and long before the public image of a newly crowned monarch had taken shape. This was not a spontaneous royal judgment. It was a hidden arrangement years in the making. What struck Catherine most was not only the secrecy, but the emotional devastation this would cause William. Highgrove was never just another estate. It was inseparable from Charles's identity, a place bound to memory, legacy, and the deeply personal story of father and son. William had long believed that Highgrove, if not formally his, would remain symbolically part of the future line he was preparing to inherit. To discover that it had instead been quietly handed to Andrew, a figure whose presence already carried controversy and tension, felt less like an administrative maneuver and more like a wound aimed directly at the heart of the future king. And as Catherine stood there, gripping the paper that had already begun to shake the foundations of royal trust, a darker realization settled over her. This was not merely a property transfer hidden behind palace silence. This was evidence of a concealed betrayal, one carefully buried until chance, or fate, placed it in the wrong hands. But the real shock was not the deed itself. It was the question no one inside the palace could answer. Why would Charles hand his most personal royal sanctuary to Andrew in secret? As whispers spread through private corridors, one truth became impossible to ignore. This was no clerical mistake. Charles III had authorized the transfer himself in silence, without informing William, Catherine, or even key palace advisors. And as hidden signatures surfaced, the monarchy found itself staring at a question darker than scandal. What secret understanding existed between the king and Andrew? What Catherine had uncovered in that sealed red box was no accidental oversight, buried in bureaucracy. The deeper palace officials dug, the clearer the pattern became. This transfer had been designed to remain invisible, protected by layers of privilege, silence, and deliberate exclusion. What first looked like a shocking betrayal was now revealing itself as something far more calculated, a secret arrangement sanctioned at the highest level of royal authority. The legal confirmation came swiftly, and with it, a chilling certainty. Palace records showed that Charles had personally approved the transfer using confidential sovereign privilege, a mechanism so rare and protected that only the monarch himself could invoke it without broader disclosure. This was not the kind of authorization that slipped unnoticed through administrative cracks. It required intention. It required planning. And most disturbingly, it required Charles to bypass the very structures meant to protect transparency within royal estate management. The deed had never passed through standard Crown Estate review. Instead, it had been routed through a private legal chamber, known only to a narrow inner circle, shielding it from the oversight of senior estate officers, who would normally have been required to examine and register such a monumental decision. That discovery sent tremors through palace ranks. Catherine, Red, shaken by the deed itself, now found herself facing a deeper wound. This had not merely been hidden from the public. It had been hidden from those closest to the throne. Several trusted estate officials, men and women who had served the crown loyally for decades, had been deliberately cut out of the paperwork chain. Their signatures were absent. Their offices had received no notification. Someone had made sure they would know nothing until it was too late to object. Then came the sealed memorandum. Though never intended for circulation, its existence quickly became known among senior aides, scrambling to understand Charles's motive. In it, Charles had reportedly described the transfer as a family legacy correction, a phrase so cryptic it only deepened the mystery. Correction of what? Of whose legacy? The language was vague, but the implications were explosive. Within hours, speculation began spreading among senior courtiers that Andrew may have held leverage rooted in old family knowledge. Private matters buried in royal history. Private matters buried in royal history. Secrets powerful enough to extract concessions even from a reigning king. When Catherine finally placed a copy of the deed before William, the emotional damage became immediate and irreversible. He read the document in silence, then read it again, as though disbelief itself might alter the words on the page. But the truth remained unchanged. Highgrove, his father's sanctuary, a symbol of continuity and personal inheritance, had been quietly handed to Andrew without warning, consultation, or trust. The betrayal was not only institutional, it was deeply personal. William's anger rose not as a sudden outburst, but as something colder and more dangerous. The realization that his father had made a decision capable of shaking the foundation of their already fragile bond and hanging over everything was one unbearable uncertainty. Had Charles intended to reveal this transfer eventually, on his own terms, after resistance could no longer matter, or had he planned for it, never to be known at all, leaving Catherine's discovery as the only reason the truth had surfaced? Yet while Charles remained behind closed doors, the palace's most dangerous reaction was already unfolding elsewhere, inside William's private chambers. For William, Prince of Wales, the betrayal cut deeper than politics. Highgrove was not just an estate, it was memory, inheritance, identity. When Catherine placed the deed before him, witnesses say the future king went silent first, and then came the fury. Behind closed palace doors, father and son were suddenly on a collision course. The monarchy had long feared. What had begun as a hidden legal revelation was now becoming something far more volatile. A deeply personal rupture between a king and the heir who had spent his life preparing to follow him. In that silence before William spoke, those closest to him understood that this was not anger over land. This was the pain of a son who believed he had just been erased from a part of his father's legacy. To William, the transfer of Highgrove to Andrew was not an administrative maneuver that could be explained away through legal language or royal privilege. It struck him as a deliberate act of exclusion. Highgrove had always carried emotional weight beyond title deeds and estate papers. It was inseparable from Charles's public and private identity, and William had long viewed it as a place bound to his own future understanding of kingship. To learn that it had been secretly promised to Andrew, without warning, without consultation, without even the dignity of explanation, felt like a rejection too intimate to ignore. The pain lay not only in losing Highgrove, but in what the decision implied. that Charles had trusted Andrew with something sacred while leaving. His own heir in darkness. That Andrew was the chosen recipient only deepened the humiliation. Within the family, his name already carried strain, discomforter, and years of controversy. William could not separate the property transfer from the symbolic insult it represented. In his eyes, this was not merely Charles choosing another relative. It was Charles elevating the one figure whose reemergence into royal privilege would inevitably trigger outrage. Palace insiders later described William's reaction in stark terms. He felt cut out of succession trust, as though the invisible bond between reigning monarch and future king had been severed behind his back. Catherine remained at his side as the emotional storm intensified, trying to steady the collapse before it became irreversible. She urged caution, warning that confronting Charles in rage could turn private betrayal into permanent fracture. But William's restraint was already slipping. Old wounds were reopening, tensions that had never fully healed between father and son, questions of control, secrecy, and inherited power that had lingered beneath years of public unity. William began asking the questions no one in the palace wanted to hear. If Highgrove had been reassigned in secret, what else had Charles hidden? Were there other estates, other private arrangements, other royal assets quietly moved beyond the heir's knowledge? Those around him understood the danger immediately. This was no longer about one deed or one estate. The scandal had crossed into something larger and far more destabilizing. A succession conflict rooted in trust itself. If William no longer believed Charles was governing royal inheritance transparently, then the crisis threatened the monarchy's internal balance at its core. The emotional damage was evolving into a constitutional shadow war between present king and future king, each now standing on opposite sides of a secret neither could fully control. And just as William's anger threatened to erupt into direct confrontation, Catherine's search through deeper palace archives uncovered something far more unsettling than betrayal alone. But as William's anger rose, Catherine uncovered something even more unsettling, evidence suggesting this transfer may have been tied to a promise made years earlier. Hidden inside archived correspondence was a letter marked private and never intended for circulation. Written years before the deed transfer, it hinted at a pact Charles had made during one of the monarchy's darkest private crises. Suddenly, Highgrove was no longer about land. It was payment on an old royal promise, buried beneath silence and shame. What Catherine had first believed to be a secret act of betrayal now began to take on a more complicated and dangerous shape. The deed was no longer an isolated scandal. It was part of a buried agreement, rooted in old wounds the palace had fought for years to keep sealed behind locked archives and unspoken family compromises. Driven by instinct as much as suspicion, Catherine pressed deeper into records few had touched in years. What she found in those confidential files changed everything. Among sealed correspondence tied to internal royal matters was a private exchange between Charles and one of his most trusted legal advisors, written during a period when the monarchy was under immense private strain. In careful but unmistakable language, the letter referenced a future restoration of Andrew's standing, phrasing so deliberate and loaded that it immediately raised disturbing implications. This was not about temporary support or symbolic reconciliation. It suggested a promise had been made, one intended to be fulfilled only when political conditions allowed. Another letter, even more revealing, pointed toward the heart of that arrangement. It implied that Charles had privately assured Andrew that if he accepted certain internal restrictions without protest, limitations that had quietly reduced his visible royal role, he would later be compensated in a way that restored dignity and status within the family structure. The language was guarded, almost coded, but the meaning was unmistakable. Highgrove may have been that compensation. Not a spontaneous gift, not a reckless indulgence, but the delayed fulfillment of a royal debt negotiated in secrecy and protected by years of silence. For Catherine, this revelation altered the emotional landscape of the scandal. She had believed Charles acted out of concealed preference or strategic favoritism. Now a different possibility emerged, one far more tragic and morally tangled. Charles may not have given Highgrove to Andrew because he valued him above William. He may have done it because he believed he owed him something. Guilt, not preference, may have been the force driving the king's decision. If so, then this was not merely a betrayal of William. It was the consequence of an old promise Charles felt bound to honor, even at devastating personal cost. Yet that did not lessen the damage. If anything, it made the wound deeper. Palace historians quietly consulted on the matter, understood immediately why this arrangement was so explosive. Highgrove was no ordinary royal property. It carried profound symbolic weight, woven into Charles's identity, his public legacy, and the emotional architecture of the monarchy itself. To use such a place as compensation in a private family bargain transformed the act into something emotionally catastrophic. It turned Highgrove into a token of unresolved guilt, making William's sense of betrayal even harder to repair. What had begun as a scandal over inheritance was now exposed as something darker, a story of hidden bargains, royal obligation, and promises made in private that threatened to destroy trust in public. Catherine now understood that Charles's silence was not protecting a legal secret alone. It was shielding a decades-old pact whose consequences had finally reached the surface. And just as she began assembling the fragments of Charles's motive into a truth too heavy to ignore, the palace was hit by a new and far more immediate shock. And just as Catherine begins piecing together Charles's motive, Andrew himself makes a move that sends shockwaves through the palace. Before the palace could contain the leak, Andrew acted. Without public announcement, preparations began at Highgrove under sealed staff instructions. Vehicles arrived, security changed. And in a move that stunned even veteran courtiers, Andrew began quietly asserting control over the estate as if the crown itself had already approved his return. What had been, until that moment, a hidden royal crisis unfolding behind closed doors suddenly became an aggressive and unmistakable show of intent. There was no formal declaration from Buckingham Palace, no ceremonial acknowledgement, no attempt to soften the shock. Andrew moved with the confidence of a man who believed the matter was settled, and in doing so, he transformed a secret transfer into a live and escalating confrontation that the monarchy could no longer contain. The first signs came through internal estate channels. Andrew's representatives, operating with striking urgency, contacted Highgrove's estate managers and demanded immediate access revisions. Security clearances were altered. Entry permissions were reassigned. Restricted residential zones that had remained untouched for years were suddenly flagged for occupation. Orders were issued with a tone that suggested long-standing authority, as though the infrastructure for this transition had already been prepared in advance and was merely waiting for activation. To Catherine, that speed was more disturbing than the deed itself. It suggested prior coordination, evidence that Andrew had known his claim would soon become enforceable, perhaps even before she had uncovered the document. Within hours, Highgrove staff were instructed to begin preparing private residential wings for Andrew's occupancy. Rooms long preserved in their existing state were reopened under confidential directives. Household personnel, many of whom had served the estate loyally for decades under Charles's deeply personal stewardship, were blindsided. For them, this was not just a procedural change. It was an emotional rupture. Several longtime employees privately threatened resignation rather than remain under Andrew's control, unwilling to serve a transition they saw as both morally troubling and deeply disrespectful to Highgrove's history. As word of the internal shift reached Catherine, her alarm deepened into something closer to dread. The speed, the precision, the lack of hesitation. It all pointed to one devastating conclusion. This was not Andrew reacting opportunistically to a new revelation. This was Andrew stepping into a plan already in motion. Somewhere behind palace silence, preparations had been made well before the truth surfaced. That realization made Charles's secrecy feel even more dangerous, because it implied that this transfer had not only been hidden from William and Catherine, but had advanced far enough to include logistical execution before the family itself knew it existed. Palace communications teams were thrown into chaos. Advisors scrambled to suppress rumors before outside confirmation could ignite public scandal. Staff were warned not to discuss changes at Highgrove. Internal memos were tightened, yet silence inside the palace only amplified tension beyond it. William, meanwhile, interpreted Andrew's rapid assertion of control as a calculated insult. To him, this was no quiet inheritance process. It was a deliberate provocation staged in a way that made his exclusion impossible to ignore. Andrew's actions felt designed not merely to claim property, but to humiliate the heir to the throne by occupying a place William had always believed would remain bound to his father's legacy. The royal household itself began to fracture under the strain. Some senior royals, quietly loyal to Charles's authority, defended the king's right to make private family decisions without interference. Others saw Andrew's actions as reckless and inflammatory, threatening to drag the monarchy into deeper scandal. What had once been a private family arrangement was now becoming a battle line dividing loyalties within the institution itself. And while tensions rose behind Highgrove's guarded boundaries, a far more dangerous force was gathering beyond palace control. But the greatest danger was no longer inside Highgrove's gates. It was outside them, where the press had begun to uncover the story. Royal secrecy survives only until one document slips into the wrong hands. By dawn, whispers had become headlines. A leaked copy of the deed surfaced in the press, and suddenly the monarchy's private fracture became public warfare. The palace had lost control, and every unanswered question now belonged to the world. What had been contained within sealed archives, guarded chambers, and frantic internal denials exploded into national scandal the moment an authenticated copy of the Highgrove transfer deed landed on the desk of a major tabloid newsroom. In a matter of hours, a hidden royal arrangement became front-page outrage, and the monarchy found itself dragged from guarded secrecy into merciless public judgment. The publication of the deed triggered immediate chaos. Headline alone was enough to ignite a storm. Charles III has secretly granted Highgrove to Andrew. For the public, the revelation was staggering not only because of the transfer itself, but because of what Highgrove represented. This was no obscure royal asset buried in ceremonial obscurity. Highgrove was Charles's most iconic private sanctuary, deeply associated with his personal legacy, his identity, and the emotional history of the crown. That such a place had been reassigned in secret to Andrew, without explanation and without warning to William or Catherine, struck the public as both baffling and deeply suspicious. News channels, commentators, and royal analysts seized on the story with relentless intensity. The central question echoed across every outlet: why had Andrew been chosen, and why had it been hidden? What might once have been framed as a private family arrangement now looked, in public eyes, like an act of deliberate deception. The secrecy surrounding William and Catherine made the scandal even more damaging. Reports that neither the Prince nor Princess of Wales had been informed until Catherine herself discovered the deed fed a growing perception that Charles had not merely acted in silence. He had acted against the trust of his own heirs. As debate intensified, the narrative quickly hardened into something politically explosive. Commentators began framing the transfer as a symbolic choice by Charles Andrew over the future monarchy. That interpretation struck at the heart of public confidence in the king's judgment. For many observers, the issue was no longer about property law or family promises. It had become a referendum on Charles's priorities as monarch. Was he protecting old loyalties at the expense of the crown's future stability? Had he placed private guilt above public duty? Inside palace walls, the damage became measurable. Internal polling and approval assessments reportedly began to wobble as accusations of favoritism. Secrecy and betrayal spread through the public sphere. The monarchy's carefully cultivated image of unity was unraveling under the weight of a scandal that now belonged to everyone. Every refusal to clarify, every unanswered question, made the silence more damaging. Charles's decision not to issue immediate comment only deepened the outrage. His silence, intended perhaps as strategic restraint, was instead interpreted as evasion. Amid the storm, Catherine emerged as the silent center of public sympathy. Once reports identified her as the one who had uncovered the deed, public sentiment shifted sharply in her favor. She was seen not as a participant in the scandal, but as the unwilling witness who had exposed it. Her restraint, her silence, and her visible position beside William turned her into the emotional anchor of the crisis. In a monarchy suddenly defined by secrecy and fracture, Catherine appeared to many as the only figure still associated with honesty and trust. But sympathy alone could not stop what was coming next. The press frenzy had made one truth unavoidable. The private explanations Charles had withheld could no longer remain behind closed doors. The scandal had crossed the threshold where internal silence was no longer possible. And the reckoning that William had been moving toward in anger was now inevitable. As the public fury mounted, one final confrontation became unavoidable. Catherine and William would demand answers directly from the king. In a private meeting shielded from cameras and courtiers alike, Catherine entered the king's chamber carrying the same deed that had shattered palace peace. What followed was not merely confrontation. It was a reckoning between duty and betrayal, between the monarchy Charles ruled and the family he was now accused of breaking a pay. Ready by the time she crossed that threshold, the crisis had already moved beyond rumor, beyond press outrage, beyond palace containment. This was the moment when silence could no longer protect anyone. The paper in Catherine's hand was no longer just evidence of a secret transfer. It had become the symbol of a family fracture now threatening to consume the institution built to survive it. Charles received her in guarded stillness, but the strain on him was impossible to conceal. The public storm outside had already reached the palace walls, and inside them, William's anger was rapidly becoming impossible to contain. Catherine did not approach him as a daughter-in-law seeking explanation. She came as the one person still capable of demanding truth without allowing rage to destroy what remained of trust. Her first question struck at the center of the wound. Why had William been excluded from a decision of such magnitude? Why had the future king been denied even the dignity of being told that Highgrove, his father's most personal legacy, was being handed to Andrew in secret? For a long moment, Charles offered no defense. Then, with the weight of years in his voice, he admitted what no one else had dared say aloud. He had kept the transfer hidden because he believed disclosure would trigger what he called a premature revolt within the family. He had expected resistance from William. He had anticipated outrage from Catherine. He feared that if the arrangement became known too early, the family would fracture before he could manage its consequences. In his mind, secrecy had not been betrayal, it had been containment. But Catherine refused to let that explanation stand unchallenged. She pressed harder, demanding to know why Andrew had been granted something so emotionally charged, something certain to wound William in ways no political justification could erase. It was then Charles revealed the truth he had protected for years. The transfer was, in his eyes, an act of obligation, a debt left unresolved from an earlier family crisis. He spoke of promises made in private, of burdens inherited as both brother and king, and of a commitment he believed honor required him to fulfill. He did not deny the secrecy. He justified it as loyalty to an old promise that had never stopped haunting him. That answer only deepened Catherine's anger. She accused him with painful clarity of confusing guilt with duty and in doing so destabilizing William's trust, not merely in his father, but in the crown itself. This was no longer just about land or inheritance. By hiding such a monumental decision from his heir, Charles had shaken the invisible foundation on which succession depends. Confidence between reigning monarch and future sovereign. For the first time, Charles seemed to grasp the full emotional cost of what he had done. He admitted, quietly and with unmistakable regret, that he had underestimated the symbolic wound the transfer would inflict. He had believed he could settle an old debt without destroying the future. Now he understood he may have endangered both. Yet even shaken by Catherine's words, Charles would not reverse the deed. Not immediately. The promise to Andrew, once fulfilled, had become politically and personally entangled beyond simple reversal. Catherine left the chamber, carrying no victory, only the chilling realization that the monarchy was standing at the edge of an internal rupture from which it might never fully recover. Yet even after that confrontation, one final decision remained, and it would determine whether this royal fracture became permanent. With Highgrove at the center of a national uproar, the monarchy now stands on the edge of its most intimate fracture in years. William is said to be weighing unprecedented action. Charles faces pressure from every side. Andrew refuses to yield. And Catherine, the woman who uncovered it all, holds the truth that could either save the crown or split it forever. What began as a hidden deed, buried in silence, has now become a full-scale crisis, threatening the emotional and constitutional balance of the royal family itself. Every corridor of the palace is now divided by tension. Every private conversation carries the weight of consequence. And at the center of it all lies one question that no one can yet answer. Can this family survive the truth that has already torn through its foundations? William, once restrained by duty and deference, is now said to be considering the unthinkable. Behind closed doors, discussions have reportedly begun around invoking formal constitutional estate intervention, an extraordinary mechanism that could challenge the transfer on grounds of succession, harm, and crown integrity. Such a move would be without modern precedent, placing father and son not merely in emotional conflict, but in direct institutional opposition. For William, this is no longer about reclaiming property. It is about defending trust, legacy, and the principle that the future monarchy cannot be shaped through secrecy and private bargains. To challenge Charles openly would risk deepening the fracture beyond repair, yet to remain silent would mean accepting a betrayal that has already scarred his faith in the crown. Charles, meanwhile, finds himself surrounded by pressure from every direction. Senior advisors, constitutional aides, and longtime royal strategists are urging him to act before the damage becomes irreversible. Some insist he must publicly rescind the transfer and restore Highgrove to royal succession control, even if it means humiliating retreat. Others warn that reversing the deed could trigger an equally dangerous consequence: a public rupture with Andrew that exposes the very private promise Charles has spent years protecting. For the king, every option now carries loss. To protect Andrew may cost him William. To abandon Andrew may unravel the last remnants of an old family debt he believed honor required him to repay. Andrew, however, has shown no sign of compromise. According to palace insiders, he has refused every informal proposal aimed at softening the crisis. His position remains firm. The deed is legal, sovereignly authorized, and irreversible. That defiance has only sharpened public anger and intensified private resentment within the family. In refusing to step back, Andrew has transformed himself from beneficiary into active antagonist, a figure whose claim to Highgrove now represents more than possession. It represents resistance against the future line of succession itself. Caught between these opposing forces is Catherine, whose role has shifted from discoverer to mediator. She alone now moves between Charles and William, with enough trust to keep communication alive. To Charles, she is the last bridge to his son. To William, she is the only voice capable of tempering rage with judgment. Yet even Catherine is beginning to understand the unbearable truth. Some wounds cannot be negotiated away. Palace insiders fear this scandal may permanently alter the story of Charles's reign, reducing years of careful monarchy stewardship to a legacy overshadowed by one catastrophic secret. And so Highgrove has become more than an estate. It is now the symbolic battlefield for the monarchy's future leadership, a place where inheritance, loyalty, guilt, and power have collided with devastating force. The unanswered question hangs over every royal decision still to come. Will Charles sacrifice Andrew to preserve the trust of his heir? Or will he cling to an old promise and lose William forever? For now, no resolution has come. The gates remain closed. The statements remain unwritten. And behind those guarded walls stands a family no longer held together by silence, but suspended in uncertainty. Each member waiting for the choice that may define the crown for generations. Because in royal history, the most dangerous secrets are never the ones hidden in vaults. They are the ones discovered by the people brave enough to open them. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.